Good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to thank those of you who have joined us here this afternoon. My name is Anita Haynes. I am the Member of Parliament for Tabaquite, and I am joined this afternoon with Senator Wade Mark, and we would be discussing a very important issue facing the national community at this time. I know many of you would have seen the news over the past couple of days where the Minister of Communications in the Office of the Prime Minister, the Minister with responsibility for government communications, Simon Nobrega, would have had a foot-and-mouth situation taking place. But what it has done, it has uncovered a series of fundamental issues facing how the public can interpret the news that we get, what the government policy is, and I'm going to go into some detail today as we look at what this means for our society at this time. The minister sought to backtrack his statement that there was a government policy that allowed state media, that is TTT, exclusive access to certain types of news coverage. In the early parts of the reporting, we were told that this was done in the first instance as a way to make the state media more viable or more competitive. And I want to go through what that means for us. The government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago in 2018 made a decision to rebrand state media, go back to the TTT brand, and create for us what they said would be the hub of local production and a space for Trinidad culture to thrive, and that they expected that in time it would become a profit-making company. Now here we are, 3 years later, with a government minister who has the responsibility to oversee and to set government policy with this regard, saying to us that the way that they have figured out to make state media more viable is to create a space for exclusive access to news. Now, this is not exclusive access to content created by the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago or exclusive access to entertainment content. It is exclusive access to news. And at a time where public trust in the information that we are getting coming from the government is critical, at a time where we have been solely dependent on state press conferences to ensure that we are informed as a public on the steps taken to keep us all safe, and the steps that are taken with respect to the limits of our movements, that these things are presented to us via the news media. So what we want as a public is a space and an opportunity that will allow critical thinking, critical assessment to take place, where we can have the hard questions asked and answered. And how do you do this? You do not do this by limiting the number of media houses or the space for the media to ask these hard questions. You do this by creating a wider space. A number of places have done it. We've attempted to do it virtually. You can do this in a very safe space. The role of the government at this point in time is supposed to be ensuring that we as members of the public can have absolute trust in the information that we're getting, because it is fully scrutinized, they are held accountable, the transparency is there. But this minister's statement over the past couple of days shows us that this is the exact opposite. The minister went on to clarify his statement by saying it's a joke. He was joking and that there is no policy. However, the practice exists because of COVID protocols. Now, you can see very clearly where we are going to run into some problems there. This is no laughing matter for those of us who exist in Trinidad and Tobago at this time. You see, using COVID protocols as an excuse to limit access, especially for live events, where the mechanism exists, the space exists to ensure that persons are socially distanced, they can have the safe spaces. Once they're fully masked up, the space provided itself for that sort of thing to happen. And instead of acknowledging that, the minister sought to defend it and use the excuse of COVID-19 protocols and keeping persons safe. And so at no point in time, acknowledged that his statement about it being policy to give state media a fighting chance was flawed, and that he apologized to the nation and that they will seek to do better. None of those things happened. So I say to the minister today, this is no laughing matter. How you treat with public information, public access to information, and how you treat with media being present at state events or media being present at any event is a critical issue to our democracy. It is a critical issue because how we consume media, it's how we form our opinions. We are in a space right now in Trinidad and Tobago where we have been bombarded with members of the government telling us what is or isn't fake news, a term that I've really grown to despise given the way that it is tossed about loosely. We are being told that we have to trust the information coming from them and trust that they are presenting it to us in a non-biased manner and that we're getting all of the facts. And then you have the minister with responsibility for government communication saying that there is no issue or that they're not even considering whether or not questions can be asked or answered. What they're considering is if the state media is giving state media house some sort of special access. And in his statement, the minister inadvertently cast very serious aspersions on the journalists, well-respected journalists who are at TTT. Because the role of a journalist in society, as we are all aware, well aware, and those of us especially who exist in the political space, is to create a very important check and balance. When we subject ourselves to interviews, to questioning, when we hold events, when we hold press conferences, and the media is present, it is to ensure that the questions are asked, the public gets the answers that they need, and that issues can be well ventilated for the public good. And by suggesting that TTT alone has this space and is part of government policy in terms of communicating news, the minister really has created a very serious problem for the journalists at TTT. And as a citizen of this country, as I'm sure most of us are, we want TTT to be viable and competitive. We want that. We want the millions of taxpayers' dollars that go into the enterprise to be investments that we are seeing a benefit coming from. And what the minister is suggesting is that the money invested is not to ensure that the company becomes more successful, that the bar is raised, but he's more willing to say, let us lower the bar, let us eliminate competition, and then maybe they'll have a fighting chance. And that's ridiculous. That cannot be the way the government sees running any state enterprise would work. And if it is, then it is very concerning for those of us as citizens of this country. If you have done any kind of careful assessment of TTT, the brand, the media house, and you've said, listen, you're not performing as we would like you to, let us make some changes. The change cannot be eliminating media houses that are not TTT or creating some sort of exclusive access. That cannot be the change. There are a number of inputs into the space to create a more vibrant working environment or to create a space that TTT is very competitive and that you're getting the viewership that you want and that you desire. But this type of thing, and so therefore the minister's excuse really does not fly. And then it leaves us to the final point. It had nothing to do with TTT. It was nothing to do with TTT itself as a brand or improving its viewership, and there was nothing to do with COVID protocols, and it had every single thing to do with government control of the messaging coming out of certain events. And if we are in a space where the government is saying that they are willing to enact executive policy making and decision making to exclude other media houses, to remove themselves from answering hard questions, to remove, and at the time when the issue is topical, because let's not forget, now this idea that the footage would be shared and that you would have access to the story, that means you have access to a framing of the story that they have determined is what they want. So we don't have a space to frame the story as an independent media house may decide to. So you have a framing that they've decided. And you also have it in our space where, like I said before, you're not able to ask questions, you're not able to get answers. And it really was the reason we were able to find out about this government practice, if it is in fact not policy, as the minister is now trying to backtrack and say, but the practice exists, and he has admitted that, and he has not said that the practice does not exist and it is changing. The fact of the matter is, right now, as we exist, the government has, in practice, said we are going to exclude certain peoples, and they have not given us any reason why this has to be so. And so therefore, in that vacuum, we are very prepared to say that they are unwilling to be held accountable, and they will only do so in their safe spaces where they control the framing and they give us a story. They present us with a final package, a finished story, and that is unacceptable. It is unacceptable when, as we exist in spaces with stay-home orders, we still exist in a state of emergency. Trinidad and Tobago, at this time, still exists in a state of emergency, where we are dependent on the media that we are consuming. We are dependent on the information that we are getting. We, as critical thinkers, as right-thinking citizens in this country, must say that the government must not use its power, cannot use its executive will to determine what we see and what we consume. We must be presented with all angles, all aspects. We must have a space for vibrant discourse, for constructive disagreement, for questions, probing questions. And it was, I guess the irony is that it was a question from a member of the media that led us to this discovery that the practice exists. And that question enabled us to have this very important decision about a government practice that we simply should not agree to. And beyond that, when we think about what members of the public have been saying, members of the public have been looking on at press conferences, have looked on at questions being outrightly dismissed. They have looked on at persons putting their hands up on the virtual press conferences and being ignored. You've looked on at limiting questions. Now, we are reasonable people. Obviously, there may be a time limit, but as persons who exist in the political space, we know sometimes if you can't get to a question, you allow the questions to be sent to you, you answer it in another medium, in another form. But those things have not been allowed to the fullest extent. We have seen time and time again where there is a limiting of government scrutiny, of government accountability, and government transparency. And it is unfortunate that the minister with responsibility for communications has decided not to take ownership of not only the thing that he said, but the practice that he has enacted, and is trying to create a joke out of it. It is no laughing matter. Nobody's laughing with you, so it's not a joke. What we are looking at right now is a government that is willing to use its executive action to control the media that we consume as the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And now I pass on to Senator Weidmark.
Thank you, my sister, Anita Haynes. Good evening, good afternoon to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Let me begin by stating very categorically that the United National Congress, the alternative government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, strongly condemns the government led by the Prime Minister, brazen and blatant attempt at censoring the media in our country through the control of the flow of information. Information, it is said, brings knowledge, and knowledge brings power. It is clear that the attempt by the government was not a joke. The attempt by the government to censor, to filter, to control the flow of information to the population was not accidental, was not a mistake, as is being attempted by the language and the vocabulary being expressed by the Minister of Communication. It is clear that there is not once, the attempt was not made once, it was not made twice, but it was made 3 times and maybe more that we are not aware of. Members of the media, citizens of our beloved republic, I want to take you to the opening of the Carnage police station, which took place a few weeks ago. The media is complaining that at that opening, there was an attempt again to give exclusive preferential treatment to TTT. And we have no problem with TTT. What we are saying is that policy and practice are what we are concerned about as it relates to the government's actions at this time. So once is an accident, twice is a coincidence, and the third time is a habit. So it started off at the Carnage police station, testing the waters. They continued that practice, which has now become policy, even though they are seeking belatedly to disown their policy. It continued with the formal commissioning of the 2 overly prized Cape-class patrol vessels bought for the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard. And then lastly, but not finally, it continued with the repatriation of over 700 Venezuelans to their homeland. Ladies and gentlemen, why would a government seek to control the flow of information that the public is entitled to receive in a democratic society? It is clear that in our Constitution, Chapter 1, Part 1, under the section that deals with the recognition and protection of fundamental human rights and freedoms, when we go to Section 4, K, there is the freedom of the press. The freedom of the press is entrenched in our Constitution. So it is becoming very, very obvious to the citizenry that a plot has been hatched at Balize House to undermine to subvert, to erode, and to compromise Trinidad and Tobago's democracy. Members of the media, as you know, democracy is never subverted or eroded by tyrants, despots, autocrats, or authoritarians in one fell swoop. But it takes place in small and at times imperceptible degrees. And this is exactly and precisely what is taking place with this PNM corrupt oligarchy, where they are engineering very faithfully, and they have been doing that over the last few years, the undermining of our democracy. This is worrying. This is troubling. This is very concerning, particularly for our fledgling and fragile democracy. The PNM has been systematically dismantling the building blocks of our democracy over the last 6 years. Our democracy is under siege and under threat. And the media, which is another institution under our Constitution, is now the latest victim